Okay, so remember when the Baltimore bank riots take place, Andrew Jackson is president. He's a deeply divisive president, and the people who oppose him think that his presidency is going to lead to the unraveling of the nation. So these newspaper articles that we've been looking at are from Whig newspapers in Baltimore. And you can see that they blame the riots, the Baltimore bank riots, and the other riots around the country. They blame it on the Democrats. They blame it on Andrew Jackson and the Democrats. What they say is the awful political outcry to rally the poor against the rich. And as here, the excitement produced by the prevailing administration doctrine of the poor against the rich. These newspapers in this era, the era of the Maryland politics that we're talking about here, were fully political. That is, papers took the side of one of the major political parties and advocated that party's point of view. The idea of a neutral press wasn't really in place. You sort of expected, oh, if you read Niles' Register in Baltimore, you're going to get the Whig perspective on everything that's happening. And if you read The Sun, you're going to get the Democratic view on everything that's happening. If you want to try to understand what's actually happening, you have to be someone smart enough to read both newspapers and try to find the truth or something like it by putting together the two strongly biased perspectives and finding some middle path. These newspapers organized politics, and they were, by the 1830s, super cheap. Innovations in the printing press meant that newspapers were now a penny a day. So cities like Baltimore were awash in newspapers. There were the giant newspapers like these that felt like they would never go anywhere, even though eventually they do. But there were also smaller papers that would appear, have a short run, a new one would appear. So at any time, Baltimore would have a couple dozen or more newspapers. The politics of this time, like I've been pointing to, were divisive. And Andrew Jackson was at the center of it. As we talked about before, Jackson was seen as advocating for the ordinary man, which, when people said that, they meant the ordinary white man. Black people, not understood by most to be part of political discourse. So, just assuming that the people of the time aren't talking about black people, when Jackson said, or when people said that Jackson was for the common man, that concept, which there's some truth in, led to reforms at the state level around the country. Remember earlier in the 1800s, Maryland had started letting all white men vote, right? Remember, they eliminated the property qualification and let poor white men into the political system. That political change was carried out in lots of other states while Jackson was president. So across the country during the Jackson years, it became true that almost everywhere, all white men could vote. The other big political change that took place during the Jackson years was a change that, again, some states had done before Jackson, but it accelerated under Jackson, was that states changed the way that presidential electors were selected. When the country started, in every state, presidential electors were appointed by the state government. But during the Jackson years, states changed their laws so that presidential electors were chosen by the popular vote. And that's the way we do it now. In almost every state, whoever gets the most votes from the people gets that state's electoral voters. Maryland. You may remember that when we've looked at previous presidential election maps, oh my gosh, let's go back and see if we can find one. Isn't this exciting? Oh, you're so excited. You remember how in a lot of previous elections we've seen that Maryland has split its electoral votes. Like here, 5 for Clay, 3 for Jackson. Ooh, let's find another one. Oh, shouldn't have pushed our luck. Oh, we're doing it. Here, look, Maryland actually split their electoral vote 3 ways. In Maryland's early history, the electoral vote was chosen by congressional district. So, however the popular vote went in that district, that presidential candidate got the electoral votes. This meant that Maryland, didn't look like these other states often did, where, whoever gets the most votes gets them all. But under Jackson, in 1833, Maryland passed a law that made it so that for the first time, starting in 1836, Maryland would be winner take all. That is to say, whoever gets the most votes from the Maryland voters gets all Maryland's electoral votes. The Whigs, you may remember, controlled Maryland throughout this period. There were all these Whig governors who I told you didn't have to know by name. Just know that there were a bunch of Whig governors during the Andrew Jackson years. The Whigs also controlled the Maryland General Assembly during these years. And the Democrats didn't like it. The Democrats felt like it was unfair that Whigs consistently won Maryland's elections. And they had some legitimate gripes. So in 1836, Maryland Democrats organized a convention where they called for either constitutional amendments or a whole new Maryland Constitution. They were upset about several different things. Not all of them were upset about the same things. But here is some of the list. Remember, ever since the 1776, the beginning of the United States with the U.S. Constitution, the Eastern Shore was guaranteed a Senate seat. Right? Remember, one Maryland senator has to be from the Eastern Shore. That felt unfair to people. They don't have much population out there. Why are they guaranteed a Senate seat? Are we really one state? Are we like an alliance of 2 states? Why, some asked, does each county get 4 delegates in the General Assembly, regardless of population? Some counties were much bigger than others. And some of the biggest counties were Democratic. So those counties with big populations that are Democratic get as many delegates in the General Assembly as the small counties that lean Whig. That doesn't feel democratic. And what really upset the Democrats was that Baltimore had now, 80,000 people by this time. And Baltimore still had the same amount of political power in the state as they did back when they had only 20,000 people. And Baltimore, with 80,000 people, had the same amount of power as Annapolis had. And Annapolis hasn't grown it's only been shrinking for decades. Annapolis had a few thousand people. And yet, it gets as much power in the General Assembly as Baltimore does. And again, Baltimore leaned Democratic. So you see, if we went based on population and changed the way the General Assembly was set up, then the Democrats would be more likely to have more seats. So the Democrats have this convention, say, hey, we should have constitutional amendments or a whole new constitution. But the Whigs controlled the state government. And all the changes the Democrats wanted would favor the Democrats. So the Whigs said, no thank you. So the 1836 election came, and at the national level, which isn't our focus here, but just for reference really quick, Jackson had served 2 terms, so he was out. The Whigs won Maryland, and notice that this time Maryland didn't split its electoral votes. It was 10 electoral votes for the leading Whig candidate, William Henry Harrison. Okay, but our focus here is at the state level. That's the Maryland election crisis. The Maryland Senate, remember, was not elected by the voters. Instead, the Maryland Senate was chosen by, and we talked about this briefly weeks ago, the Maryland Senate was chosen by electoral voters who are not the same as the presidential electoral voters. They are Maryland electoral voters. Maybe there's an easier way for me to try this. How about this? Voters who were rich enough voted for electoral voters who then picked the members of the Maryland Senate. Did that work? Nod your head if it worked. All right, it worked for some of you. I'll try it one more time. Only people who met a wealth threshold could vote for the electoral voters who then picked the members of the Senate. So, what the Democrats did here is the Democratic Senate electoral voters. I don't know the right term for them to not be confusing, but we're talking about the state level. Is that clear? These Democratic electoral voters refused to show up to pick the members of the Senate. They just wouldn't show up for the meeting to pick the members of the Senate. And based on the rules that existed, if there weren't enough electoral voters, then you couldn't hold the vote to pick the members of the Senate. They're trying to hold the government hostage to get the changes they wanted, or to get at least some of them. And the public seemed to turn strongly against the Democrats and what they were trying to pull, which felt to most like a sort of unconstitutional power grab. And even in counties that seemed to lean Democratic, people came out to meetings, condemned what the Democrats were doing, and ultimately, the Democrats backed down. They backed down The Senate of 1837 took shape. But then, in 1837, the Whig governor now acted like he was for reform and supported amendments to the Constitution that gave the Democrats some of what they wanted. And now, with the governor and a whole segment of the Maryland Whigs on board, along with all the Democrats who wanted the reforms the whole time, there were a bunch of constitutional amendments passed in 1837 that, many of them, made Maryland more democratic. And here, I don't mean like big D Democratic Party, I mean small d, more power to the people. I've put some handy arrows in to point us to the significant changes. Aren't those cool looking arrows? Thank you. High five me. Psh. Okay, so first, senators will now be chosen by the popular vote. And the same people who are eligible to vote for delegates can vote for senators. Second, and we're just going to the blue arrowed parts. Second, senators don't have to be extra rich to be elected. They just need the same qualifications as members of the House of Delegates. Third, they change the allocation of delegates per county. Annapolis goes down to 1. Baltimore City goes to 5. That's still not proportionally fair, but it's more fair than it has been. And then they say, after we do the next census, we'll reapportion so that counties get no fewer than 3 delegates and no more than 6. Now, that's still not totally proportional based on population, but it's going to be a lot more fair based on population than the old system. And under these new rules, Baltimore gets to elect as many delegates as the largest county. The largest county gets 6. So Baltimore gets 6. Is nowhere near fair to the number of people who live in Baltimore, but it's more fair than the old system. Next, the governor now gets elected by the people. And they snuck in this provision, which is not related to the previous ones. Any effort to abolish slavery, which they don't even use that language, but any effort to abolish slavery must be approved by the unanimous consent of 2 consecutive legislatures and cannot be approved without a full restitution to the master for his property. Dang! Snuck that one in. We're almost done with this section. It's been a long video, but we're going to make it. These amendments to the Constitution ended the election crisis. But it didn't completely end the feeling of unfairness. Baltimore had 1/3 of the state's wealth, 1/4 of the state's population, and now, even under the new system, 6% of the House of Delegates. So, Democrats still around the state, not just in Baltimore, recognized that if Baltimore could get proportional representation, Democrats would have a much better chance of getting political control of the state. Couple little notes. Carroll County, created in 1837. Charles Carroll had finally gotten dead in 1832 at the age of 95. And Carroll County, named for him, taking away parts of Frederick County and Baltimore County as they previously existed. Also, 1837, for the first time, a bill allocated money for education, tax money. Tax money allocated to each county based and obtained from each county based on the amount of the white population in each county. Basing it only on the white population was important because they didn't want counties that had lots of black people to get more money for education, because none of the schools are supposed to be for black people. The schools are for white people. So that would mean that counties that had lots of slaves or lots of free black people would basically get better funded schools for white people if you just base it on population, which is why they make sure it's based on the white population. But even in this law, there was a provision that allowed counties to opt out. So lots of counties did. This meant that Maryland's education continued to be a kind of patchwork mess, where some counties and the city of Baltimore developed good public schools, and other counties did nothing at the county level. In the counties that did nothing, and the counties that had public schools, there were also a whole set of academies, like academies that were private and accessible to those with some money. With this patchwork system, it's kind of remarkable to me that in 1850, the Maryland illiteracy rate was only 5%. That is, the Maryland white illiteracy rate was only 5%. There was still not much real support for higher education, but the University of Maryland had a medical school, a dental school, and a pharmaceutical program, which were generally well respected, I think. That continuing political conflict eventually led to a new constitution. Generally, southern counties and the Eastern Shore were opposed, thinking they would lose power. The convention took place in 1850, and the Constitution took effect in 1851. Among the important changes that went a little further than the 1837 constitutional amendments, they reapportioned the assembly again, so that Baltimore went all the way to 13% of the House of Delegates. They were by this time about 30% of the state's population, so that's not fair to them. But remember, they were 6% of the House of Delegates before this. Why didn't Baltimore get fair? Like, what if they're 30% of the population? Why don't they get to be 30% of the House of Delegates? Because the Eastern Shore was threatening to secede, which they've talked about multiple times. And the Constitution also ended imprisonment for debt. which was a big deal to a lot of people who got locked up for tiny amounts of money. There, we did it. Next, we'll start part 2.